Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture, which is part of our engagement programme for our Stories from the Stores exhibition, which is part of our Dynamic Collections project underway at the museum. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to Ed Tuka today, who's going to be talking about some of the research he's been doing as part of his volunteering here around the First World War. I'll hand over to Ed.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to this talk, which is Mud, Men and Machines, Lincolnshire's World War I story from Winterton to the Western Front. This lunchtime lecture will be an overview of some of the main talking points for the experience of fighting on the Western Front during the Great War in 1916, with special emphasis on North Lincolnshire's involvement. And my name is Ed Tuka. I'm in the third year of a military history undergraduate degree at Lincoln Bishop University, which you might know as Bishop Grosseteste or Bishop Grot University. As part of this course, we did have a module covering elements of the Great War, or as later known as the First World War. I'm by no means an expert in the field, so I will try to answer any questions you've got at the end of the talk, but I'm also very keen to hear your accounts of any family members' service in the war and the like. And please, if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment. We will try and get back to you as soon as we can. I'm going to start by playing a short clip from the wonderful Blackadder series, which encapsulates how we tend to think of leadership during the war. Just play the first 60 seconds or so, please.
Climbing out of our trenches and walking very slowly towards the enemy. How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information. It's the same plan that we used last time, and the 17 times before that. Exactly. And that is what is so brilliant about it. It will catch the watchful heart totally off guard. Doing precisely what we've done 18 times before is exactly the last thing they'll expect us to do this time. There is, however, one small problem. That everyone always gets slaughtered in the first 10 seconds. That's right. And Field Marshall Haig is worried that this may be depressing the men attached. He's looking to find a way to cheer them up. Well, his resignation and suicide would seem the only. Interesting thought. Make a note of it, darling. The healthy humour of the honest Tommy. Don't worry, my boy. If you should falter, remember that Captain Darling and I are behind you. About 35 miles. Well, you know what this means. If it's true, sir.
The Melchett character, of course, is very much based on Field Marshall Haig. Haig remains a controversial figure, despite eventually leading the British Army to victory on the Western Front. Although this was only achieved with what many consider unacceptable losses. Though I would question whether the soldiers on the front were actually lions led by donkeys. The donkey description coming from the brain laugh that General Melchett, played by Stephen Fry, displays so brilliantly. In fact, Haig cared very much for his men, toured the front lines regularly, and founded the Royal British Legion in 1921 to help care for veterans of the war. Grimsby Chums picture up, please. Great Britain at the start of the war was the only major European power without a mass conscripted army. In fact, our standing army was so small in comparison with the Germans, their Chancellor Bismarck was once reputed to have said, if the British Army landed in Europe, I'd get Belgian constable to arrest them. If you get some poster, please. So in August 1914, Lord Kitchener, then head of the British Army, was at the call and thousands of men volunteered for service in the new armies. It was part of this, it was realised that local ties could be harnessed for national gain. Many men more men would enlist if they could serve alongside their friends, relatives and workmates. These became known as the Pals battalions. Famous ones include the Preston Pals and the Leeds Pals. And of course the only one known as the Chums battalion, the Grimsby Chums, a name apparently suggested by Lady Doughty. While many did come from Grimsby, they also include volunteers from all over Lincolnshire, including Scunthorpe, Barton, Lincoln and Boston, with a nucleus, and as I understand it, many of the officers and NCOs being old boys of Winterton Grammar School. With 800 men joining and the 5th Battalion of the Lincolnshire Regiment already fully subscribed, they became the 10th Battalion, which also included 150 Wakefield men who formed D Company. Lord Yarborough donated land on his Brocklesby estate and training began in earnest. The Chums were initially clad in blue serge material left over from the telegram service before later getting their khaki uniforms. Here they drilled, learnt to shoot, had bayonet practice and of course learnt to dig trenches. Trenches had quickly spread across the 600 miles from Switzerland, across France and Belgium, and the static warfare that we so associate with the Western Front had started. In August 1914, some 6 million men had been mobilised by the European nations, and the military plans of all the belligerents had been based that if a war was not to be disastrous, it needed to be won quickly. This was especially believed by the German staff in Berlin, who had calculated that they needed to defeat the French army in 6 weeks so they could transfer sufficient forces to counter the expected Russian attack from the east. Germans aimed to achieve this by using a great outflanking movement through the Belgium, as proposed in the Schieffelin Plan. Despite the obvious signs such as railheads being constructed towards the Belgian border, the Germans in fact managed to catch the Allies by surprise. It was the reported atrocities for this campaign, with over 5,000 Belgian civilians shot and the indiscriminate setting fire of public buildings, which helped to make the recruiting into armies such as the Pals Battalion so effective. This attack was finally halted at the Battle of Marne in September 1914, with the British Expeditionary Force playing a full part in the battle. The German lines fell back to the line of the Aisne, where they established positions, which they then successfully defended for the next 4 years. During late 1915, the Grimsby Chums shipped out to France, and as was the practice in January 1916, they were initially placed in trenches in quiet areas where they lost around 4 to 5 men each month before being deployed to the Somme in June 1916. The Germans had already seized the high ground, which any student of military tactics will tell you gives a great advantage. If nothing else, you can see and therefore direct your fire at the enemy forces before they can see you. And of course, it's much harder to charge up a hill than charge down a hill. You can also hide your reserves just out of sight. Just behind the ridge, as Wellington famously done at the Battle of Waterloo just over 100 years previously. At that time, the French were not on our side. In this war, they were very much on our side. In fact, the whole offensive, which took place far earlier than Haig had hoped for, as he didn't think the new British troops were quite ready, and which played an influence on his decision for his men to walk straight towards the enemy, rather than using more advanced tactics of small units covering each other during an advance. To understand the timing of the Somme offensive, we must look at the French experience at Verdun in 1916. On the 21st of February 1916, the Germans launched an attritional attack on the salient. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff, intended to bleed France white, and the French, led by Generals Henri-Philippe Pétain and Robert Nivelle, had no choice but to reply, if you excuse my French, "Ils ne passent pas, they shall not pass." During this campaign, the French were to suffer around 400,000 casualties, with 163,000 dead and 216,000 wounded, and it was essential that the British relieve the pressure on the French army, as it was in danger of collapse. The British attack on the Somme began with an artillery barrage initially scheduled for 5 days, but then extended to 7 days, and over 1.5 million shells were fired. On the first day, the Germans actually troops stood to arms in the trenches awaiting an attack, but soon came to realise they were in for a long wait. These attacks included poison gas, and air observers reported huge damage to the surface of the German trenches. The British had also had a cunning plan for attacking the Germans with their height advantage. The slope up to the German lines meant they could dig tunnels straight on the flat, which by digging horizontally would go underneath the German positions. This wasn't a new military tactic. It had been used in medieval times during the sieges of castles. What was new was the sheer volume of explosives they planted. 72,000 pounds of amatol, which was planted at what became known as the Lochnagar mine, after what is believed to be 150 yards from the British lines and directly underneath the German trenches. This was detonated beneath the German trenches at 7:28 a.m, 2 minutes before 0 a.m. At 7:30 a.m, the Grimsby Chums pushed forward to occupy the crater. They did so further 150 yards behind the initial starting point from their own lines, where they'd been placed so as to protect them from the anticipated blast of the mine. The explosion was so powerful that it was actually heard in London. Soldiers reported that the ground beneath them shook like jelly. Aerial observers from the Royal Flying Corps, flying 3,000 feet above, reported parts of the ground went over 500 feet above their heads. The Chums had been told the Germans could not possibly survive the huge artillery bombardment and the force of the explosion, and they were very unaware that unfortunately the mine had exploded 15 metres short of the German lines, and that their machine gun posts, skillfully positioned to catch any attackers in a crossfire, had survived the impact intact. The German troops, after 7 hellish days under virtual constant bombardment, waited in their trenches, rifles ready, observing the advance through very long periscopes, ready to climb up at the very last possible moment. Some 120,000 men went over the top that day. Some of the men involved had not even been equipped with rifles at all. Haig was convinced that the effectiveness of the artillery barrage would have left very few of them alive. He wanted men equipped with items to fortify the expected German trenches when they were captured. Now, as ordered, the Chums advanced at walking pace. Now, this is a matter of dispute. The guys from Western Front Association say that this order never happened. There's no written evidence of it, although there is recordings of veterans saying that has happened. At any event, they couldn't advance any great pace because of the amount of equipment they had and how broken and muddy and dreadful the ground was. As they advanced, they were met with a hail of bullets, and at least 160 men lost their lives on the first day. And most of the Chums then occupied the crater, which was reported to be 300 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and they were harassed there by both German and British artillery fire for the rest of the day. A very small handful of the Grimsby Chums actually made it as far as the German trenches. The only officer to make it was Second Lieutenant Harold Pending, who led 5 men to the German reserve trench, the 3rd trench in their frontline system. And gathering stragglers as they progressed, he held off a series of German counterattacks before having to retire. In total, the Grimsby Chums suffered 502 casualties on the 1st of July, 15 officers and 487 other ranks. Only 2 of the officers came back unwounded and only about 100 men. The British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties that day. Some say over 60,000, the worst day in its history. The Battle of The Somme witnessed the very first combat action of a tank, designed and built in Lincoln, a major technological development aimed at breaking the stone into the trenches. We'll return to this later in the talk. Now, you might be wondering this 7-day artillery bombardment was so ineffective. It was partly due to a shortage of high explosive shells, so shrapnel ones were used. These were designed to explode and send metal splinters flying. They could be very effective against both infantry and cavalry in the open, and had been widely produced prior to the war, when a more fluid, faster-moving conflict had been anticipated. Given that this type of shell was expected to be used, the British soldiers started the war without being issued any proper head protection. The soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force were initially, when to Western Front in 1914, did not even have the limit of protection offered by the pickle helmet issued to the German soldiers. They'd only been issued with a fabric service or forage caps. The Brodie helmet, if we could see the picture please, on the slide is in that collection. So we associate with the image of Tommy's, began to be issued in September 1915. By the summer of 1916, Brodie's have been issued to all British troops. At the start of the Great War, German soldiers wore the pickle helmet, or in English, the spike bonnet. See the picture of that. This was perfect for grand parades and peacetime, but far less practical for the demands of trench warfare, as experienced on the battlefields of France and Belgium. It was mainly constructed of leather. The metal pieces were purely ornamental. This again offered troops very little protection against artillery shells. These shells were normally designed to burst in the air and rain down shrapnel, such as metal fragments, onto the heads of the enemy soldiers. In early 1916, this helmet was replaced for those on active service by the Stahlhelm or steel helmet, popularly known as the coal scuttle. I could probably talk for a little while longer about the failure of the initial bombardment, but out of over 12,000 tons of explosive used, only about 900 tons represent high explosive. And I once did a whole presentation on the number 106 fuse, which was instantaneous direct fuse action used to remove barbed wire. But this wasn't really introduced until early 1917, and to good effect on the Battle of Vimy Ridge. It wasn't available at this stage. If anyone is interested in finding a more in-depth account of the Battle of Somme, I would highly recommend a book called The Face of Battle by John Keegan, which looks at this battle as well as Agincourt and Waterloo. And during the 4 terrible days of this slaughter at the Somme, the cinemas in Grimsby showed reels of training footage recorded on the Brocklesby estate to the families and loved one of the soldiers, unaware that many of the men captured on film were already dead or dying. This was also not the end of the fighting for the survivors. They were also involved in some of the bloodiest battles of the war, including Arras in April 1917 and Passchendaele in October 1917. In May 2001, on the site of the Active Park Industrial Park near Arras, a 15-metre-long pit containing the remains of 20 British soldiers was discovered during preventative archaeological excavations. I'm going to read a translation of what they recorded. If you show the picture. For the forgotten dead of Point de Shore. The first 19 bodies have been carefully laid down on their backs, their hands crossed in front of them, with the arms folded in such a way that all the soldiers were shoulder to shoulder. A number of shoulder insignia bearing the inscription Lincoln indicated these soldiers belonged to the 10th Battalion of the Lincolnshire Regiment, a unit active in this zone from April the 9th to April 13th, 1917. Symbolism of this arrangement is clear. It becomes all the more poignant when we consider that the nickname of this regiment was the Grimsby Chums, hailing predominantly from the small port town of Grimsby in North East England. This unusual non-regulation grave is a particularly strong example of the strong bonds of camaraderie which united these men. Interpreting and understanding the surface of this barrier was a major challenge for the archaeologists. The soldiers were reinterred in 2002 in the nearest military cemetery. And since I wrote this talk, in the last couple of days, 4 more bodies have actually recently been reburied in a special ceremony at Lewes Cemetery in France. And they were also 4 men from the Grimsby Chums. They were Privates Arthur Cook, Privates Robert Cullum, Private John Fraser, Private William London. Robert Cullen was one of 6 brothers out of 10 who served on the Western Front, 2 of which lost their lives. And all 4 of these men were part of a 5-man machine gun crew. One, Fred Blakely, actually survived the war despite being badly wounded and received a military medal for his actions that day. And all 4 were killed on the 5th of May 1917. So even all these years later, we are still finding the remains of those brave men. This Battle of Arras itself witnessed one of the major technological developments of the war, that of air power. And arguably the most important battle of the war in the air was the so-called Bloody April in the skies above Arras in 1917. How the young pilots were treated was described by Peter Hart in the British Journal of Military History as outnumbered, lacking even basic flying skills, outgunned and flying totally obsolescent aircraft. The young boys of the Royal Flying Corps went to their deaths due to the blind intransigence of their commanders. They died, like the men on the ground, to sacrifice the doctrine of offensive at any cost. The best known German fighter race of the war, the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, deliberately targeted these new pilots in order to increase his kills, with much reduced risk to his own life. This reflected the German policy of a defensive air war, Lustkraft, and including elite Jaster squadrons. The Luftwaffe, or the German Air Service, had already been outnumbered, so adopted the more defence strategy of only going into the air to intercept reports of Allied aircraft crossing over German lines. Unlike the British, who concentrated on the offensive side. One consequence of this, if the Germans were forced to glide down to land following engine failure, which was very common in this very early days of aviation, they did so on their own side of trenches and lived to fight another day. The British, on the other hand, as they took a far more offensive approach, would cross German lines, and this would result in their capture and becoming a prisoner of war when they were forced to crash land. One other thing to note is that the Royal Flying Corps, which became known as the Royal Air Force in April 19, did not issue ripcord parachutes to its air crews until 1925. Do any of you have any idea why?
That may be to do with the weight of them or something like that.
That's a really good idea. I really like that. Unfortunately, it was a more horrible reason. They were concerned that the pilots might exhibit cowardice and might jump out. So sadly, a lot of them would burn to death because they couldn't escape their burning planes. And the planes were mainly wood construction outfits in those days. But they'd be burnt alive in the air and were unlikely to survive the fall should they jump out. The Battle of Arras started on the 9th of April, but the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service started the week before, being heavily involved in photographic reconnaissance, spotting for the artillery, and offensive patrols to stop the Germans observing the build-up and preparations for the battle. The 3 tests saw them set by Hugh Boom Trenchard, head of the Royal Flying Corps. Trenchard was an interesting character. He was nicknamed the Camel by some of his fellow officers, as he neither drank nor spoke, and hadn't actually learned to fly until he was 39 years old. He only had 1 lung and was partially blind following service in India, South Africa and Ireland. At one point, he had critically injured his spine, but actually managed a freak recovery after being involved in a bobsleigh accident. The tactics he employed had worked at the Somme, as the British and French had recently introduced some new advanced aircraft, such as the Sopwith Pup and the Newport 11, 16s and 17s. After the Germans, though, had introduced the Albatros D1, his technological advantage had been lost. Also, the Germans introduced new tactics, which meant they attacked in packs when Allied aircraft crossed the lines. And this was reported by their troops in the trenches, which resulted in local air supremacy in numbers. The Red Baron had taken over a squadron equipped for the Trust D13 fighter in January 1917, which had given the Germans the performance edge. There were 3 other squadrons in the same area, as well as others nearby, although they were still outnumbered by the Royal Flying Corps forces. By the end of April 1917, the Royal Flying Corps had lost 245 aircraft. The average life expectancy of a British pilot was just 11 days, with over 250 killed and a further 108 made prisoners of war. The Germans, in comparison, had lost only 66 planes, a 4-to-1 kill ratio. Now, bearing in mind the primary role of the Royal Flying Corps was spotting of artillery and giving intelligence to ground units, not in air-to-air combat, you could perhaps think, was the British pilot sacrifice worth it? Should the Allies have adapted similar tactics to the Germans and forced them to combine? And although you could probably say the Germans won the bloody April Air War, the actual result is far more nuanced, as the Royal Flying Corps achieved its objective of air reconnaissance and photographing the opposition, and beginning effective spotters for the artillery, albeit at great cost to their own lives. I have some statistics for this we might find interesting. The number of targets on which the batteries were ranged from aeroplane observations on the 1st and 3rd Army fronts was 767. The number of artillery targets still engaged by the German artillery on the whole British front, estimated by wireless intelligence, was 160. They took 5,216 photographs, and of those, over 124,000 prints were made and distributed. 842 flights were made for artillery work, compared to 320 by the Germans. And the number of armed machines which crossed the front line, others from for short distance or for long distance, over Mons and Herston and other well-known locations, was over 5,000. Where the Germans only, if the estimate of our anti-aircraft guns, for anything to go by, about under 500. 107 bombing and machine gun raids were carried out. But perhaps the most remarkable statistic, given the amount of losses, that at the start of the battle we had 887 planes available. At the end, on the 19th of April, we had 890. At this point, we'll return to the brave men of the Grimsby Chums, as this was not to be the end of their story. They were held regular get-togethers after the war, and actually many went on to serve again in the Second World War as part of the National Defence Company of the British Army. A not very well known but more professional version of the Home Guard, exclusively for ex-servicemen, aged between 45 and 60. It was formed in 1936, and they were called out at the outbreak of the war in September 1939. They played a key part in defending our infrastructure at locations such as Immingham Docks and local airfields. We used latterly to guard prisoners' war camps, freeing up younger men for frontline duties. This discovery of 20 men in shallow ground 84 years following the death seems very unusual to us now. In fact, many thousands of bodies were never recovered in the terrible mechanised slaughter of the Great War, destroyed totally by modern warfare waged on industrial scale. Huge artillery barges, mortars and mines were simply swallowed up in the mud at no man's land. The poet Wilfred Owen described no man's land as being like the face of the moon, chaotic, crater-ridden, uninhabitable, awful, the abode of madness. Over 50,000 names of the missing are listed on the Menin Gate in Belgium, including a local lad from Winterton, just outside Scunthorpe, by the name of Private Archibald Brown. Spread a copy of the letter, please. And the letter you can see on the screen was sent out to his grieving mother Nellie in 1926. The interesting thing you can see, if you look at the details of Archibald's unit, he hadn't joined one of the territorial PAL's units, but the newly formed Tank Corps. There was also a booklet accompanying that letter. Quick opportunity to read it. I'd also say this isn't the only place Private Archibald Brown is commemorated. There are not one but two memorials to All Saints Church in nearby Winterton, including this rather beautifully painted wooden plaque inside. The first tanks were designed and built here in Lincolnshire, in Lincoln itself. The name tank, which has since been adopted all around the world and is used in many different languages, was actually part of the security measurements surrounding its development. They were described as water carriers, or as workers at the Foster and Sons factory called them water tanks, supposedly designed for the Mesopotamian front. By further confusion to the enemy, the first tanks, which went into production in February 1916, were labelled with care to Petrograd. Some of the workers apparently believed they were building snow plows for the Russians. Whilst not seeking to advertise a rival museum, if you want to see one of those World War tanks up close, pop along to the Museum of Lincolnshire Life, where you can see definitely the tank. There's a Wikipedia entry on the history of the tank states that the offensive used tanks took place on, or the first offensive, on the 15th of September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme, when 49 of the Mark I type were committed, of which only 32 were mechanically fit to take part in the advance, and achieved some rather small local successes. But to my mind, this doesn't really tell the full story. Having gone to such great lengths to disguise the entry of the tank into warfare, to use them in such few numbers, before they were properly tested and made mechanically reliable, and their crews properly trained, and then to show them to the enemy so they're able to prepare against future attacks, seems a mistake. Winston Churchill described this decision in his war memories as the ruthless decision, or the ruthless desire for a decision at all costs led in September to more improvident disclosure of the Caterpillar vehicles. Churchill at that time was First Lord of the Admiralty and had encouraged the creation of the tank, and hence some of the early tanks have more maritime names, or parts of them had, such as the bow, and possibly explains why some of the generals resented the intrusion of a rival service into their domain. In July 1917, when Private Archibald Brown at the Third Battle of Ypres lost his life, 216 tanks were employed. The tanks found it almost impossible to operate in the muddy conditions and achieve very little. This battle also consumed the lives of infantrymen as around 2,000 a day, and the tank was judged to be a failure. Despite opposition from many generals, Haig decided to continue with the production and use of the tank. At the Battle of Cambrai on November the 20th, 1917, saw its first real success, with 380 tanks advancing 4.5 miles on a 6-mile front, with minimal casualties. In stark contrast to the previous offensive, which measured advances in yards for thousands of lives lost. This battle was not fully exploited, we argue, was the decision of General Harper, commander of the 51st Highland Division, who has been described as a narrow-minded soldier of the old school. He didn't believe that the tanks would be able to capture the Hindenburg line, so delayed his troops assault until 09:30, and the line was crossed at 08:30. That meant the tanks were forced to face well-placed artillery at short range without infantry support, and at great cost themselves. With 16 tanks being destroyed, and those not killed by shell fire burnt alive. This delay meant the British forces were unable to exploit the situation, and the cavalry meant to exploit the gap were too far back to go into action quickly, and horses are no match for machine gun fire, especially when facing the added obstacle of barbed wire. By this stage, there were no real infantry reinforcements available anyway due to the losses suffered at Ypres. The Germans were able to bring their reserves into position and quickly plug the gap. This situation was made even worse 10 days later when the Germans counterattacked and recovered most of the territory that had been taken. General Sir Julian Byng, in charge of the area, ignored intelligence reports from men on the ground and refused requests for artillery supports. The British tanks had been withdrawn and prepared for enrolment to the rear lines. It was only the bravery and initiative of the tank commanders on the ground which helped halt the advance. The British were still lost 6,000 men taken prisoner, thousands more dead and wounded, and vast amounts of equipment. In the subsequent inquiry, Byng blamed the poor soldiers on the ground, many of whom had lost their lives, limbs, or liberty for his mistakes. And while I try to take a balanced view of Field Marshall Haig being described as a donkey, in this case, his decision to support Byng rather than his troops in the front line was absolutely an error. Thank you all for coming out today. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I'd welcome both any questions which I'll try to answer. And if you have any tales of your own family members and their part in the Great War, or have been able to bring any memorabilia along, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That was brilliant.
Good for some doors.